So, good evening. We are here to celebrate the publication of Eleanor Clift's Selecting a President, co-authored with Matthew Spieler. Eleanor Clift has appeared at Politics and Prose for all of her previous books, some written with her late husband, Tom Brzaitis. Eleanor, you were a friend of independent bookstores, and especially Politics and Prose. Many of us were riveted by your 2 weeks of life, a memoir of life, death, and memory, and fanatical politics. Your insights on how we deal with death and fail to deal with death stay with those of us who read you to this day. Nearly 22 years ago, Eleanor and Tom joined Carla and me and 20 or so others on Carla's first Politics and Prose trip. It was a literary political trip to what were some of the former communist countries. We met with authors from Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and from the communist part of Germany. We went to Auschwitz and Theresienstadt. We also ate decently, had fun, and enjoyed each other's company. What Eleanor and her co-author have accomplished in selecting a president is to make the election system understandable by breaking it into manageable parts, giving us history and wonderful stories, some of them iconic, and taking away any excuses for not being informed. We learn what happens if no candidate receives a majority of the Electoral College. Even in a two-person race, there can be a tie where someone may not receive a majority, as remote as that is. So here's a book for the high school or college graduate or near graduate. And having read the book, I can tell you there's plenty for a family to discuss. Eleanor, I loved your dedication to those who educate us on civics and your respect for those who run for office. We know Eleanor Clift as a journalist, as a TV political commentator, and even as a person who's been featured in movies. Tonight, we welcome you as an author. Let's welcome Eleanor Clift to Politics and Prose.
Thank you, David. I do remember that trip. We went to several countries and we traveled by train, and the Cold War had just ended. And every time you crossed a border, somebody would come into the cabin and shine lights in your eyes. And Tom and I actually shared bunks with David and Carla. And Carla wanted us to experience life at the level of average human beings, and we did. and it was grand. It was wonderful. So Politics and Prose brings back so many memories. It's the neighborhood bookstore, I'm sure, for all of you here, and we love it. So thank you, David. This book is a little different for me because it doesn't express opinions, which is what I get paid to do on television and also in print. And it is a straightforward account of how our political system works. And to be honest, the publisher came to me and saw a gap in our education system. They do not teach civics anymore. I'm sure young people out there are wondering where the 527s and the super PACs came from. Who invented them? Did they come from the founding fathers? How does this system work? The primaries this year certainly entertained us, but what did they have to do with how we select a president? So I believe if this is successful, it will be the first in a series, and if I'm not giving away too much, I think former Senate Leader Tom Daschle will be working with some wonderful researcher and writer to put together a similar book on how the Senate works, and David Obey, who recently stepped down from the House, is being contracted to, I believe, write about how the House works. So we hope to fill what the schools no longer do. For me, this was doing the research and working on the manuscript. It really is a refresher course for political junkies because nobody selects a president like we do in this country. And the Republican primary season and the debates is certainly a case in point. Although in Egypt, they actually staged a presidential debate, and they showed clips from some of the debates in this country to sort of educate the populace, which I shudder to think that we're exporting some of this. But again, the way we do it is it's got its drawbacks, but it's better than anything else that's been tried. The crowded stage early this year on the Republican side, I think, only had really two plausible prospects, and that was Mitt Romney, who is now the obvious nominee, and briefly John Huntsman. I think everybody else was in it for various reasons, and maybe partly their own delusions, but that's the wonderful thing about running for president. You don't actually have to think you can win. There are lots of other reasons to run, and among them is to influence the party platform and shape what the eventual nominee will run on. So political primaries, the proliferation of primaries that we saw now is really a relatively recent phenomenon. In 1968, Hubert Humphrey won the nomination without competing in a single primary. It's kind of unimaginable. The power was in the hands of the party establishment, and they dismissed the voter preferences expressed for Gene McCarthy in New Hampshire and certainly Bobby Kennedy in the California primary, who was sadly assassinated the night he was to win the California primary. Then Humphrey's loss to Richard Nixon in 1968 triggered calls for reform. So we got the McGovern-Fraser Commission. George McGovern, South Dakota senator, and Minnesota Rep. Donald Fraser. Together, they worked to come up with a set of reforms and rules where women, young voters, and minorities would be represented in proportion to the population. In the 1972, just 4 years later, 40% of the delegates in Miami at the convention were women. That was my first convention. I was a telex operator for Newsweek. I worked in our suite in the Fontainebleau Hotel, and I was really starry-eyed. It was wonderful to watch the politicians, and politicians to me were stars and celebs, and in a way they still are. In 1968, 13% of the delegates were women. So that gives you an idea of how much reform occurred in those 4 years. So George McGovern, I lived in a little vacuum myself. I thought everybody I knew supported George McGovern, and I was rather shocked when he didn't win. But he got the nomination based on the rules he had devised and written, a little bit like Dick Cheney getting the vice presidential nod after going out and leading the search committee. But George McGovern lost in a rather major way. He only carried Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. So what came out of that? 1976, Jimmy Carter, he saw what George McGovern had did, and he noticed there was that opening in Iowa. So Jimmy Carter spent probably the better part of a year sleeping on couches in people's bedrooms and getting known by the people of Iowa. Jody Powell's memorial service a couple of years ago, President Carter told the story of how difficult it was to get any press in Iowa as the former governor from Georgia. And he said, finally, Jody scored a television spot early in the morning. And he said, they're driving to the TV studio. And Jody says, by the way, well, it's not Mr. President, I guess it was Jimmy. By the way, Jimmy, do you have any favorite recipes? Well, they get there, it's a cooking show, and the host is wearing an apron and a chef's cap. So I believe Carter came up with a recipe because he was prepared to do virtually anything to reach his goal, which was to win the nomination and the presidency. Carter, of course, one-term president, although I think his legacy will be seen in a much more favorable light than it has been. And I actually have a piece that's going to appear on the Daily Beast website over this weekend, which is about Jerry Rafshoon.